My name is Amol Sinha. I'm the Executive Director of the ACLU of New Jersey. I'm just really proud to be here in this space with you all. But before we get started, I wanted to introduce our friend Steve, who runs the New Jersey Historical Society. So Steve, please.
Well, I just wanted to welcome everyone tonight to this wonderful event and to the New Jersey Historical Society. Just to tell you a little bit about the Historical Society, we were founded in 1845. We're the oldest cultural institution in the state of New Jersey. We're the largest private repository for New Jersey material in the world. And our building looks small from the outside, but it's actually about 30 to 35,000 square feet. So the places you don't see is where we keep all the archives and the artifacts. We're a museum, a research library, and we get people from all over the world that come to the research library. And we're also an education center with classrooms. So feel free if you need any questions or if you have any comments and you want to see me, I'll be here all night. And so thank you very much for attending this wonderful event. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Steve. And Steve didn't mention this. I encourage people to come back and visit the Historical Society and make sure that you check out their website and click the donate button because they certainly deserve it. Next, I wanted to introduce my friend and colleague, Luis Torres, who's got some words for us. So I wanted him to start us off tonight.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is Luis Torres, and I want to thank the New Jersey Historical Society for hosting this event and this important message that we can all together come across, and especially to Steve, thank you. I want to thank the ACLU, of course, for their invitation to speak on the issues that we will talk about this evening. And I want to thank my new friends, of course, Sandra and Cynthia, for allowing me to share the table with you tonight. My life instantly headed into a tragic turn as a juvenile when I was 16 years old, impacting many lives for which I was held accountable for. I was ultimately sentenced to 30 years to life. I spent my adult life making significant life-changing decisions to make amends for the horrible actions of 1991. And making these decisions I wanted to do was for myself and my family and the Baker's family also. I was committed to doing the right thing, and I did just that. Education was among the decisions that I made earlier on. And all those decisions gave me the opportunity to look at the world very differently. In 2013, I was selected to be part of the New Jersey Scholarship and Transformative Education in Prison, also known as the New Jersey STEP program. The New Jersey STEP, the New Jersey STEP program is a higher education institution in New Jersey that works in partnership with the New Jersey Department of Corrections, the New Jersey State Parole Board, to provide higher education courses towards college degree for students on the inside, and to assist them in their transition to college life upon their release from prison. This is done in partnership with Mountain View Community College, Jewel University, Princeton University, Remington Valley Community College, and of course, Rutgers University, and other institutions who have contributed to this initiative. I have to thank the New Jersey STEP team, Dean Chris Agins, Professor Diamond Rodriguez, Mr. Fudge, my academic counselors, especially Hajo, and all the professors who were instrumental in my education while I was on the inside, and who assisted me in my transition after incarceration. I earned my associate's degree in Justice Studies, and this May I graduated from Rutgers University, Newark. I earned my bachelor's degree in criminal justice. did. But this past December, I went to Georgia and spent Christmas with my oldest daughter, Crystal, and my grandkids, Zachariah and Leilani. For the new year, I went to Pennsylvania to welcome the new year with my brother and my nephew and the rest of our family. On January 7th, I went back to Georgia to welcome my third grandchild, Theo. I even went to South Carolina to surprise my sister, who I haven't seen in decades. And as a representative of the Returning Citizen Support Group, a reentry organizations that provide reentry services for men and women who are returning home from the carceral space, I was part of several speaking engagements. I was a panelist on at the 35th Annual Legislative Assembly that was held in New Brunswick. I walked on stage at the Prudential Center on May 16th to receive my bachelor's degree from the Dean of Criminal Justice, Bill McCarthy, and I took my moment as I earned it. Thank you. And I tell you this because all these accomplishments and many others that I have been blessed to experience would not have been possible if the New Jersey Supreme Court in State versus James Comer did not reject the notion that juvenile offenders are permanently incorrigible, irredeemable, not able to be rehabilitated. We have proven that that is not the case. And I'm one of many examples that they got it wrong. The many unrecognizable heroes who walk in our streets are proof that these terms or characteristics do not apply. Men and women who come home from the carceral space and have committed to changing their lives, you wouldn't even know who was walking among them because they were doing the right thing, because they were given a second chance. Before I conclude, the Comer ruling has changed many lives and has given hope to those juvenile offenders who didn't have hope that they would ever return back home. And this is, and I really have to thank my beautiful family. Thank you so much for your continued love and support, because without you, I wouldn't be the man I am today. I also have to thank and acknowledge the ACLU for their tireless efforts in the Comer case. Sid Huff for your direction. Of course, Alex Shalom for your dedication to making sure that juveniles get their chance fully. Larry Lussberg, I recall him, and his team at Gibbons. My brilliant and compassionate attorneys, Lisa Waters, public defender out of Union County, Todd Heffron, public defender out of Hudson County, and her team for her commitment to making sure I walk out the door. Alicia Hubbard, as everybody knows who she is the best, and I thank you. I thank you for putting such an amazing case together. It was one of those cases that was unprecedented, and they had no room to deny my motion because of their work. I also have to thank Investigator Nicole Gasper for her tireless pursuit In fairness, she went beyond her core duty as an investigator. I thank Dr. Joel Nunez for his professionalism and humanizing me. I want to acknowledge Mr. Percor, and I hope I'm saying it correct, Public Defender of Suffolk County, and the Office of the Attorney General, because they too were supportive of juveniles getting that second chance that most juveniles deserve. We are changing the narrative, and this is where it starts. By having me sit next to you, having me on the same table, we're changing the narrative today. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to change that narrative. So I thank you, and let's have a good time tonight.
All right. Thank you so much, Luis. This is working, right? Is this, yeah. Stick it close. All right. So, thank you so much again, Luis. Changing the narrative. That's what tonight is about. So, years ago, we at the ACLU of New Jersey set a visionary goal. We wanted to end mass incarceration. And for us, reducing our prison population was, of course, about individual liberty and freedom, and those things are incredibly important. But it was also about our moral compass as a state. It's about racial justice, economic opportunities, civic participation, healthier communities, and more. It was about dignity and humanity. Over the last decade, we at the ACLU-NJ and our partners, including people and families impacted by incarceration, have achieved enormous strides toward decarceration in New Jersey through victories both in the courtroom and in the legislature, and of course in the space of public opinion. All combined, these victories have contributed to New Jersey's historic reduction in its prison population by more than 50% since 2011. And the most dramatic and impactful reductions actually only happened in the last 3 years as a result of our collective advocacy with leaders and partners across the state. This was done by passing a one-of-a-kind law to release nearly 9,000 people early during the COVID-19 pandemic and reducing the prison population by more than 35% in that moment alone. It was done by arguing a landmark case, which Luis mentioned, State v. Comer, to ensure that no child is forced to spend their entire life in prison, and allowed nearly 100 young people to petition for early release. We also legalized and decriminalized cannabis, significantly reducing drug arrests in our state. And bail reform has been a resounding and successful, stable success. But we also know that there's more to be done to undo and repair the harms of mass incarceration. There's a lot to be proud of in New Jersey for sure, but we haven't yet reached our potential. Still, too many people are locked up, and still, racial disparities make New Jersey notorious. A black New Jerseyan is 12 times more likely to be incarcerated than a white one. And still, we haven't embraced common sense reforms like ending mandatory minimum sentences. And as we all know, fear-mongering and tough-on-crime rhetoric is on the rise, even though crime rates across all crime categories are down. So we need to tell the story of what we've achieved. We need to push back on the fear-mongering, and we need to state firmly that our work is far from over. To do so, just today, the ACLU of New Jersey released a report entitled Decarcerating New Jersey, a Transformative Vision of Justice. I invite you all to take a look at it on our website. It's aclu-nj.org/decarceration. This is a report that uses data and facts to demonstrate the current state of incarceration in New Jersey and pathways to further decarceration that will benefit families and communities. This includes enacting public policies proven to work by pushing for more reforms to the criminal legal system, and fighting back against fear-mongering and harmful false narratives. I'm proud to be a New Jerseyan and to live in a state where decarceration is possible, because we've done it, and we've seen the fruits of its labor. And now is the time to do more. So to discuss what's happening in New Jersey, what's happening nationally, and what more we have to do at every level, we convened this all-star panel of experts, and I'll introduce them one by one, but of course I'm not going to go into anybody's very impressive biographies. I'm just going to read their titles. So first we've got Cassandra Federi, who is the Executive Director of the Drug Policy Alliance. Next we have Cynthia Roseberry, who's the Acting Director of ACLU National's Justice Division. We have my colleague Alex Shalom, who's ACLU of New Jersey's Director of Supreme Court Advocacy. And last but not least, who you heard from, we have Luis Torres, who holds a BS in criminal justice and has lived experience in the carceral space. So please join me in welcoming our esteemed panel. So I'll start with some questions about the national landscape, and then we'll go into what's going on in New Jersey specifically. So I thought I'd first start with my friend Cynthia. So Cynthia, as we all know, the 70s, 80s, and 90s were filled with lawmakers ratcheting up tough on crime narratives and policies. And then in the 2000s, we saw some increased awareness of the crisis of mass incarceration, and some policy ideas followed. Now it feels like we're sliding backwards again. Lawmakers at every level are amplifying their tough on crime talking points and fear-mongering and chipping away at the progress that we've made. So can you share some thoughts on what's causing that? What's behind it all? And are we at risk of fueling another era of mass incarceration?
Well, thanks for that question. First of all, thanks for having me here. It's my pleasure to be here in New Jersey, and congratulations on that amazing report and the work that you've done. I think you've already named one of the chief reasons that we're seeing this rhetoric, and it's racism, right? It's the elephant in the room. It is no accident that Black and brown people are overrepresented in our carceral system. You want me to talk louder?
I think everybody should be a little closer to their mics.
So Michelle Alexander reminded us that there's this conspiracy, in the new Jim Crow. And I have to admit, I was a little bit skeptical of it. But when you look at statistics like someone who's Black being 12 times more likely to be incarcerated, you have to acknowledge the unbroken line between the slave patrol and policing today, even down to the star that's in the badge that is apparent. I was recently listening to Wesley Lowery, who wrote a book called American Whitelash. And Wesley talks about this tug of war in America between white supremacy and, let's just say, the rest of us, right? And we've seen this tug of war since the inception of America. We saw, some of those pictures there from the Historical Society I was looking at beforehand. We certainly saw it in 1845 when they were founded, right? But we're still seeing it today. And he talks about that pivotal moment in Grant Park when Barack Obama was elected president and how elated we were. I happened to be in Chicago in that moment. And it felt like what I believe Woodstock must have felt like. People were hugging and you could smell weed. The best environment, right? But that in that same moment, there was a grasp on that rope, right? And the tug started to pull the other way. And I think that's where we are now. It feels like we're in the space, in the tug of war, where the factions that would have us move back to white supremacy, or more deeply into white supremacy, I should say, have tugged back to, sort of the Dred Scott decision. Even as we're awaiting a decision about affirmative action in the Supreme Court right now, right? So there's an uneasiness about the progress that's being made for people who feel that their privilege and their power is being wrestled away from them. And that's rooted in white supremacy and racism, right? I think one of the other reasons, and I'll be brief as you know, is economics. mean, prison system is about capitalism. Do not get it twisted. I was looking at some reports from the Prison Policy Initiative, a report called Follow the Money of Mass Incarceration. Private companies that supply goods to prison commissary or telephone and correctional facilities make about $2.9 billion each year. And governments pay private companies about $3.9 billion to operate prisons. You add to that about a $1.6 billion commissary vending industry, not to mention the exception to the 13th Amendment, where folks are enslaved and working as slaves, picking cotton. You might hear I sound a little funny, I'm from the South. They pick cotton in Louisiana in the prison system. They pick cotton in Alabama today as slaves. So economics drive it as well. And the third thing that I'll just name briefly is that it is a path of least resistance to return to that rhetoric. It's a lazy way of thinking, right? And it appeals to sort of the most base among us. We did some research about the midterm and the election before that, and what happened in the election was that the predictor of who would vote a certain way was their unhappiness. Their unhappiness. And this, more than poverty, more than lack of education, all of those things contribute, right? But there was this unhappiness. I mentioned this uneasiness, right, about losing power. And so it is easy for our elected officials to return to that rhetoric that served them in the past. And I can talk a little bit more later about how we're tired of hearing that. We don't want to hear that.
Thank you, Cynthia. Cassandra, turning to you. So coinciding with the decades of mass incarceration, and perhaps most concretely fueling it, was the so-called war on drugs. What was the impact of the war on drugs on mass incarceration, and what continues to be its harm and its legacy today?
We get asked this question quite a bit. What is the impact of the drug war on mass incarceration? And it's a complicated issue, and it's not a complicated issue. I think it's really important for people to know that we could end the drug war and let everyone out of prison that has a drug charge, and it would still be mass incarceration. Right? It is not the drug war that is propelling mass incarceration in this country. We are, people that are in prisons are 1 in 5, so that's 20%. That's not a small amount, but I think there is this illusion or this rhetoric that if we just legalize cannabis, everyone would be out of prison. That's not true. And it actually makes it harder for us to have the real conversation about what is necessary for us to stop relying on punishment as a means to deal with harm and conflict. So what I would say about the drug war is that yes, it is an engine of incarceration in prisons. It's one of the biggest reasons why people are in and out of jail. And the drug war is the engine behind mass criminalization. Drugs gives the government the excuse to take away your privacy, make you pee in a cup to get a job, make you have to basically consent without knowing in order to give birth in a public hospital. The reason why people don't get, the reason black people don't get access to pain medication because they think that we are drug seeking. It has shaped the way that we think about the role of the carceral system. It is also the main engineer for people to get into relationship or be related to by law enforcement. Drug possession arrests are the most arrestable offense in this country by a landslide. Most of those are still for cannabis, despite the fact that there are multi-million-dollar companies that are selling the product. So when people ask me the question about how has the drug war impacted mass incarceration, I think it's strengthened incarceration. I think it's given the government more opportunity to criminalize things. I think it's made it faster. And I think the other thing is, while drugs may not be one of the top charges as to why there are so many people in jails and prisons, it's not like it's not there. So even if someone is in incarceration for property crimes or violent offenses, drugs are often like the second or third crime. Also, drugs are a way that you get whole groups of people. Conspiracy, RICO charges, they perfected that with drugs. And so while we may not be, while ending the drug war will not end mass incarceration, having the conversation about drugs, because it's so emotional, because it's so layered, because it involves so many different aspects of life, is a great way to have conversations to disrupt the feelings that create the society for the U.S. to be the most jailing country in the world.
Thank you for sharing those thoughts. I mean, it is remarkable how the dots are more connected than we often realize, and how I love the tug of war analogy, because there is a true grappling between white supremacy and racial justice constantly, and it impacts all of us in every space. And the thread is more connected and more of a spectrum and ideologically continuum than we realize oftentimes. Cynthia, we've seen states across the country with varying degrees of success attempt criminal legal reforms aimed at addressing mass incarceration and reducing our prison population. Can you share a little bit about what you're seeing across the country and what's working and what's not?
Sure. So one thing that I want to do is co-sign what you said, Cassandra. We did some advocacy at the national office around clemency for drug offenses, and you may know that President Biden pardoned everyone who was charged with marijuana possession in the federal system. That resulted in 0 people being released from prison. 0 people being released from prison. In the federal space, we are seeing some movement. We just had some clemency done on the federal level, and we've also seen some states move toward clemency. Oregon, we call one of our superstar states, Governor Kate Brown, as she was leaving, gave clemency or pardon about 471, my glasses on, see, it's not even 471, it's 47,000. That Kate was not a 1. 47,000 people as she left office, which is a tremendous impact. In Pennsylvania, we saw Governor Tom Wolf release about 580 people. The previous governor in Wisconsin, we had the governor of Missouri. In Arkansas, we had Asa Hutchinson release some folks. So we are seeing this momentum around clemency. We call it our redemption campaign. And I think of it as a way not to redeem those who are in prison, because we've wrongfully imprisoned them. It is to redeem America for having done that wrong to them. That's right. In Minnesota right now, there is a bill to constitute a different clemency sort of panel, because parole and pardon wasn't working, it was moving slowly. So this new process will bring a lot more transparency and opportunity for folks to be released. So across the nation, we are seeing movement toward clemency and criminal justice reform. We're also seeing the backlash with bail reform we saw here right in your own backyard, and some of the other related issues. There's been this idea that you put fault on the reform, but it's not the reform, it's the system that caused the need to reform. I think there's an African adage that said, I'm going to stop going downstream and picking people up who fell out, and I'm going to go upstream and figure out why people are moving downstream in that way, right? And I think we're starting to see that. The backlash from that, but you asked for some solutions. Really, most of us, some of the polling that we show, is like 80% of people support criminal justice reform. 70% of folks that we survey believe that we need to reduce the numbers in prison and jail. So we, the people, want this reform. And this includes people who have been victims of crime. It includes people who are on all points in the political spectrum, right? Because the thing about mass incarceration is we put so many people in prison that everybody wants somebody out of prison. Now, because everybody's got somebody in prison, right? So it's on everybody's doorstep. And so the idea is to offer solutions in this moment and to move together, right? We are the power, we are the voice here that can make this change. And as we push our legislators, as we push those executives who can grant clemency, that's our way of tugging back in that tug of war.
Can I ask a follow-up? What's motivating some of those governors that you mentioned? Is it the goodness of their hearts? Like, what's getting them to do those amazing things?
That's a great question. I'd like to say the goodness of their hearts, and there are some who feel that way. One of the narratives around the grants of clemency that we're trying to change is that you do it on your way out, or that you do it as you would a turkey at Thanksgiving or Christmas, right? And so, yeah, really. And so we've seen folks make these grants on their way out of office when they're at the end of their political careers, if you will. Our efforts are to educate them so that they'll know that we will support them when they make those efforts. But I think there's also some practical reasons. It costs a lot of money to keep people in prison. And as the prison population ages, it costs even more to keep people in prison, right? And so not all of the reasons are altruistic, but we'll take them when we can get them.
Understood. Cassandra, so there's a growing movement to legalize and decriminalize drug use and possession. How do we make sure we get it right? And what's the pushback that you're seeing, whether from law enforcement or other groups?
Drug policy is a very popular issue in multiple communities. It crosses racial and political lines. The younger, more middle-aged people are more supportive than some of the older people. But sometimes I think the old people lie on the polls because the most growing population that's using cannabis are senior citizens. So I don't think they say yes, but they definitely buy stuff, you know? What I would say is that there are a lot of conversations that we need to have about how we build our alternative response to drugs in our community. You know, the current response, or the previous response was, stop doing drugs. Don't do it. If you do it, we'll bury you under the jail, right? Just say no. Or you're killing your community. Or you don't care about yourself. Or you hate your family. These are themes and conversations that we've had for a really long time. There's been a lot of movement and organizing by people who use drugs, the people who love them, the people who sell drugs, people who love those people, which has really been about understanding that drugs have always been a part of our society. It is our response to drugs that is actually shifting. And that it is our commitment to punishment and the cost of that love affair with punishment that has made it more dangerous for us as a society. More dangerous because our communities don't have the resources needed to help people when they struggle with drugs. More dangerous because prohibition actually creates more dangerous drug supply. And I want to say this very clearly, and especially since there are a lot of black folks in this room, so speaking directly to you. When it comes to drugs, the movement that you are able to see fastest is the drugs that white people like.
Yes.
Okay? Y'all know this.
Mm-hmm.
Also, the drug that is most likely to be criminalized is often a derivative of the drug that white people like. Cocaine is crack, right? Okay? Different laws. Different perception of people who used it. I'm here to tell you, a lot of white people used crack. Okay? We're talking about opiates right now, right? A lot of conversation around heroin. Well, not around heroin, around fentanyl. Started with the prescription pills that Black and Latino people couldn't get access to because they would tell us to take Tylenol as opposed to giving us an opioid because they would say, well, you'll get addicted, right? Or you're just looking for drugs, so I will not acknowledge your pain. They cut the pill supply down. People moved to heroin. They cracked down on heroin, and we now have fentanyl. People were not looking for fentanyl. Fentanyl is a result of prohibition. There are people now who have never had heroin, have only had fentanyl. And that is squarely on our policy positions. That is squarely because of drug prohibition. We are in a place where our regular kind of infrastructure to support people that are struggling with drugs no longer is sustainable. And frankly, it was never really sustainable. But it's really not sustainable now as we move to a place where people are creating drugs. Not drugs from the earth, like cocaine and heroin and weed and mushrooms, all from the land. Now people are making drugs in labs. And they are going faster than the laws can hold up with them. And they are being cut in the drug supply because you don't need as much heroin as you need fentanyl to make as much money. It goes back to economics and the capitalism associated with prohibition. And so now we're in a situation where we must talk about the regulation of all drugs. And we must talk about the regulation of the supply that people who are struggling with drugs are accessing. Because people don't even get a chance to get a second chance if they use fentanyl and they don't know it, or they use too much, or the tolerance is too much, or the potency is too high. They don't get the second chance because it moves way faster. Where we had hours before, we have minutes. So we need to get to a place where we're willing to have the conversation about how do we create a legal supply for the people who are struggling with it. We also need to have a conversation about what is the economic structure we need to have around the regulation of drugs. Because people act like we don't have it right now. There is an economic structure around drugs. There are markets right now. The conversation around drugs and regulation is really about who accesses it, how are we accessing it, are we going to advertising it, are we going to let big companies run it? Everything you're seeing with cannabis is what we can see with other drugs, but we might not want that. I personally don't want that. And if we are having a conversation about drugs and regulation, we have to have the conversation that we not just find policies for the drug, but we actually build a system for people. Because there are people that have legalized weed but are still getting arrested for weed. Yeah. There are people still in prison for weed. There are people that still can't get access to jobs because of weed, right? And so the conversation is less about the substance and more about how do we as a people want to build community around a regulated drug supply? How does this connect to mass incarceration? Why is it necessary for us to have a conversation about drugs? The reason why I would argue that a conversation about drugs is super necessary is because social change around drugs is happening faster than a lot of other social policy, a lot of other criminal justice policy. I'm still working on cannabis. I just went to a conference where there were 12,000 people talking about legalizing mushrooms. Drug policy moves faster, and the decision points that happen in drug policy shape everything else. That's why people will have an okay conversation about ending mass incarceration for non-violent drug offenders, but refuse to have a conversation about people who commit violent crimes. So in the conversation about legalizing drugs, in the conversation about decriminalizing drugs, there are key factor conversations and questions that we must raise that can be extrapolated to other social change issues. And because the conversation around safety is not just about criminal justice, it's about healthcare and it's about the social welfare state. And with drugs, you have to not just talk about legalizing the drugs, but what about the supports that are set up for people that get in trouble? You decriminalize drugs, but there's no housing. You decriminalize drugs, but people don't have access to healthcare. Or the healthcare is still criminalized. So it's important for us to see drugs as an opportunity for us to try out innovative policies, but also to ask really hard questions about the things we're most scared about.
Sandra, before you put the mic down, you said something about violent and non-violent offenders. Can you say more about that? Like the dichotomy that exists and how arbitrary it is sometimes?
So one, I think it's important to name that when the modifier of violent can be misleading. Because people think that violent is always as if some harm is happening to someone else. It can also be just the aggravating condition of the charge, but also the fact that sometimes they talk about property. A lot of times they talk about property. Because as Cynthia said earlier, there's so much connection between incarceration and arrest and slave patrol that we were 3/5 of a person, so we were considered property. That we were an inanimate object when people created the criminal legal system. So there's that. But two, and I will say this because I'm often in the room that has to say this, is folks that have done drug policy reform as a means of political expediency would say, like, we should just like get rid of all the terrible criminal justice policies around drugs, because people who use drugs don't harm other people. They're just harming themselves. Just let them go, let them mind their business. And those people are safe to let go. But other people are not safe to let go. And sometimes, all the time, that's always wrong. Because it's like, if we have decided that incarceration is a terrible system, then why is it good for this person and not for that person? And whose life is actually more important? And the truth is, we screwed our own selves in the drug policy space because people were like, well, you can let the marijuana people go, but the crack people, let them stay. So it's really about every time you draw a line where you're like, don't cross it, the way that the machine works of incarceration and criminalization is, you got to feed the beast. You can start off with the people that you want, but eventually the machine takes over and you got to feed it something. So to me, when people are like, well, you know, it's just black and white. No, it's not. It's a lot of white people who get incarcerated. It's a lot of white people that are getting, that are struggling with drug addiction. And that's because the beast needs to be fed. So once you build it, they will fill it, right? And once you create the idea that this person's okay to be thrown under the bus, then you just assign that to everybody else. It might take longer to get to you, but it's gonna come back. And it's not helpful for us as we build a conversation about what a new vision is if we're so busy focusing on who can't come.
So I just want to add a little bit, because the violent, non-violent dichotomy, it gets in my craw. I think it's important to open up how that looks. It looks like the discretion of a police officer deciding that a purse snatching is a theft or it's an assault, right? That categorization changes it over to violent, right? In Georgia, where I practiced for many years, a mere aspiration was a kidnapping. So this was a kidnapping, right? And so when we think about increase in crime and violent crime, and we also pair that with the idea that our policing system in America is deeply racist. The roots are so deep that they're hard to dig up. Then we know that the reporting of the crime, the creating of the crime, is based in racism. And And so you have the situation where, again, we have to either admit that our system is racist or that we believe black and brown people are more criminal.
And then you have the perpetuation of police statistics that funnel more money into those communities for policing and more arrest rates as a result. It's just like a self-perpetuating vicious cycle. I'm going to pivot now and talk about New Jersey specifically. So Alex, I'll turn to you, and then to Luis. Alex, as we talked about a little bit before, New Jersey has come a really long way in its effort to reduce our prison and jail population, specifically as a result of things like bail reform, like our releases during the pandemic, and more. Can you share a little bit about the specifics and what we've done?
Sure. So let's start with bail reform. We'll talk about that first. And in order to talk about where we've come, we have to talk about where we were, right? And so go back to 2012 when this conversation really started in earnest in New Jersey. The Drug Policy Alliance put out this deeply impactful study that was called the Jail Population Analysis. It was a day in the life of New Jersey jails. Just took one day and said, we're going to figure out everyone who's in jail in New Jersey. And what we learned was that there were about 9,000 people in jail who were presumed innocent. 9,000 people who had been convicted of nothing. And so then the question is, okay, well, why were they there? And they were there because they couldn't afford money bail. And so we think about that, we think, well, maybe they had really high money bails because they were charged with really serious stuff. But that's not what the study showed. The study showed that 50% of the people were not charged with crimes of violence, sex crimes, or weapons offenses. 50%, more than 50%. 1/8 of the people incarcerated on any given day were being held on bails of $2,500 or less. So now, look, there isn't really a correlation between the amount of bail and whether someone's going to show up, but generally speaking, judges would issue higher bails for the more serious stuff and lower bails for the less serious stuff. So 12% of the population could have gone home if they had $2,500. So we weren't jailing the people that were causing the most harms to our community. We weren't jailing the people who were least likely to show up in court. We were jailing poor people. And so that fails on both levels, right? It keeps poor people who should be home in jail. And it lets dangerous people who have access to money go home, right? And so we had this weird situation when this happened because we had a Republican governor, Chris Christie, you may have heard of him, he's running for president again, and we had a Democratic legislature. And they had very different interests. But the advocacy community came together to say, look, I don't know what system we're going to build, but whatever we do, it can't be that. It can't be a system where the size of your wallet determines your freedom, right? Because that makes no sense. And so it's a long process, and I won't bore you with how we got there, but advocates came together and pushed for a proposal. The legislature bought on it, and I will say, I'll be the first person to insult presidential candidate Chris Christie, but he bought into the system too, right? He wanted a new system because he wanted the ability to detain people who were perceived to be dangerous. That's why he came to it. But by the end, he was talking about our jails as modern-day debtors' prisons, which they were, right? So he bought into our talking points. I've said it before. I wanted to send him an ACLU card. I don't think he would have taken it, but I wanted to send him a membership card, right? And so New Jersey did in 2014 what other states have failed to do, which is we passed a bail reform law on a bipartisan basis. And to be clear, it wasn't perfect. It wasn't even great, but it was a lot better than the disaster that it was replacing. And so it took a lot of compromise from advocates, from law enforcement, from no one loved the system, but everyone thought it was going to be better than the one it was replacing. And so it goes into effect not until 2017. But what we saw was almost immediately that 9,000 people who were incarcerated pre-trial and innocent, that number dropped and dropped and dropped. And it dropped, and you can see it in the report if you go to our website, but it dropped into around 5,000. And in fact, when the pandemic hit, that number had dropped to just about a tiny bit over 4,000. So there's a 55% decrease in the number of people incarcerated pre-trial in New Jersey. Now, that's still about 3,900 too many people incarcerated pre-trial, but it's a lot better than 9,000, and I'm so glad we started today's event hearing from Louis, because we're talking a lot about numbers, right? I'm throwing out numbers, and it's 5,000 fewer people, 55%, and like the math nerds all love it. But I think what we need to step back and remember is when you go from 9,000 people to 8,999 people, for that person, it's as big a deal as it could possibly be, because they go from being incarcerated to being free, being locked up to being home. And so these numbers matter because they represent people. And so that's the short, so let me just give you 2 more minutes on bail, which is, we did a great job driving down the population. Jails, as you might understand, right, people come in because they get arrested and they go out because their case gets resolved, they get dismissed or they go to prison or whatever. When the pandemic hit, this part stopped happening. People were still getting arrested, but our courts shut down. So people weren't getting deals, they weren't getting cases dismissed, they weren't going home. And so our jail population increased. And so we went from 9,000 down to 4,500 or so, and now up to 6,000 or 7,000. And it's stayed there. So one threat we had to bail reform was that we weren't processing enough criminal cases and getting people out and home such that those numbers went up. But the other threat is the one that you talked about earlier, Nicole, which is this kind of desire of politicians to blame problems, real problems, like poverty, like lack of access to health care, like lack of opportunity, and perceived problems, like rising crime. Now, crime is rising in some parts of this country. It's just not actually rising in New Jersey. Violent crime is down, shootings are down, murders are down, right? But you have every politician, and let's be clear, I don't want to just disparage Republicans, Democrats and Republicans who say the reason crime is going up in New Jersey is because of bail reform and we need to change it. So every single part of that statement is bullshit, right? It's just all not true. Sorry, every part of the statement is a lie. And so we have this political winds pushing hard against us and using fear and false narratives, and we need to push against it with facts and reality. And so that is the short version of where we stand on bail reform today, but not that short version.
Well, so before we get to Louis, I just want to talk a little bit about the public health emergency credit, which I think it's highlighted in our report. I certainly recommend everybody read it. The short version is that when the pandemic hit, we got together with folks at the ACLU and some partners outside of us, and we started saying, who is the least likely to be saved by our government? And that was people who were incarcerated, right? And we decided to focus, in that moment when we were reshifting priorities, every organization was figuring out the chaos and figuring out the new normal, we decided to focus our attention on the people that were incarcerated, because incarceration wasn't designed with social distancing in mind, right? Like, it was designed to warehouse people in close quarters. So the things that we could do on the outside to protect ourselves were just not feasible inside, right? And so, Alex, you want to say a little bit about what we decided to do and the strategy that we took on, and
Sure.
then we'll come to Louis.
Sure.
And
I'm gonna
actually do that in 1 minute, and also talk very briefly about Comer, and then we'll go to
Transition. Okay, so really quickly, first thing we did when the pandemic hit is we teamed up with the Office of the Public Defender, and we went into court to try and get some people out of jail, and we had some immediate success in the first week. This is before there had been a single COVID death in New Jersey. 697 people released from our jails, basically with an agreement we had worked out. And we went back to court and tried to get some people out of prison, and it didn't go far. And we asked the governor to issue an executive order, and he did, and it didn't result in many people being released from prison. So at a certain point, we decided, those of us who like to sue people for a living, like me, decided that it wasn't working anymore. We kind of gotten all the juice out of the orange, and if we wanted to free more people, we were going to need another approach. And the approach that we came up with was one that only happened in New Jersey. They toyed with it in some other places, but it only worked in New Jersey, which was the public health emergency credits. By June of 2020, New Jersey had the disgusting distinction of having the highest prison death rate in the country. More people had died because of COVID in New Jersey in prisons than anywhere else in the country. And we went to the legislature and we said, this is shameful. When people get sent to prison, putting aside whether anyone should get sent to prison, but they shouldn't be condemned to die there. And they shouldn't, they're locked in their cells, they can't get out because they're trying to pretend they can do social distancing. It's harder time. We got to get people out. Let's start with people who are getting out anyway. So we looked at people who were going to get released within a year. And what the law that we and partners drafted and the legislature adopted did was that if you're within a year of release, we're going to take 8 months off of your sentence. Now, it wasn't exactly as we wrote it. We wanted everyone to get a year off of their sentence, but it got a lot of people out. And what it meant was the bill was signed in August, September, October, with an effective date of November 5th, the day after the presidential election. I think they didn't want this to get a lot of press. And it meant that 2,254 people were released from prison on a single day. Right? It was the largest single release in New Jersey history. And Sarah's here. Sarah and I spent some time at Newark Penn Station, welcoming people home, just like people coming home and saying, welcome home, how can we help? And over the course of the pandemic, which of course, when we thought about the bill, we thought the pandemic was about to end. It lasted a lot longer. Between the legal advocacy we started with and the legislative advocacy we ended with, 9,000 people went home early. Now, the crazy thing about that is you have lots of folks in the legislature who are saying, see, that's why our crime rates are soaring. Well, remember what I said, our crime rates aren't soaring. And in fact, when some criminologists at Rutgers looked at the recidivism rates among people released 8 months early with very little preparation to get them ready to re-enter society, their recidivism rates were lower than the typical recidivism rate from someone who's getting out of prison, which begs the question, if we can let 9,000 people out of prison 8 months early without harming public safety, why aren't we letting 15,000 people out of prison 8 months early without harming public safety? Okay, really quickly, now Louis teased it a little bit in his opening remarks, but we just, at the ACLU of New Jersey, finished one of our longest running cases, which was representing James Comer. In 2013, we decided to represent him. He had been a 17-year-old who had been involved in a series of robberies. One of his co-defendants, not him, no one ever alleged it was him, shot and killed someone in the robbery, was charged with felony murder and the robberies, was offered a deal where he would go home in 17 years, turned it down. 17-year-olds don't always make great decisions. He went to trial, he was convicted, the judge gave him a 30-year sentence on the murder, a 15-year sentence on each of the robberies, and then ran them consecutive to one another. So his total sentence was 75 years, 68 3/4 without parole, which if you're doing the math meant he was condemned to die in prison. And so we argued at the time that that violated the New Jersey Constitution, that it was cruel and unusual punishment as applied to a child, and we won. This was in 2017, the court agreed that a de facto life sentence, as was the functional equivalent of a life sentence, and he could get resentenced. He got resentenced and he got a 30-year sentence, and we appealed again, and that's now what Louis talked a little bit about, which is the court held that even a mandatory 30 years was the minimum sentence you could get. When you're talking about someone who is 15, 16, or 17 years old, you couldn't decide at 15, 16, or 17 who they would become. And they deserved a chance to come before a judge and show that the person they were at 35, 40, 45 was different than the person they were as a teenager. I know it's true for me, I know it's true for all of you. And that's what we were able to do for James. He was able to get that hearing. And that's what Louis and other folks were able to do. And that is, when we think about the numbers, it's not a staggering number, it's 100 people. But when you hear about the things that Louis has done in the last 6 months, right? Whether it's college graduations or the birth of a grandchild or travel or speaking, when you think of those opportunities and multiply them by 100, the impact becomes pretty amazing.
Thanks, Alex. Louis, we met a few months ago, and I was brought to tears by your story. And you've been so gracious with your time and spending it with us, especially at the ACLU. You've come over and talked to us about it. Tell us a little bit more. You started it, but tell us a little bit more about what the Comer decision meant for you.
Give you some context, right? In the early 90s, there was a huge wave of children being cuffed and sent to jail. There was a huge wave of children being waved up as adults and sent to adult jails. 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, without the benefit of the kind of impact that would have on a child. The courts did not look at the kind of psychological or emotional impact that would have on a child. All they saw was punishment. That was a huge wave during the 90s, and those who at the time were children and got arrested during the 90s now get the benefit of petitioning the courts after 20 or 30 years to get a possible resentence. But for 2 decades, for decades, 2 decades, or 3 decades, no one ever thought of the impact that putting the cuffs on the children was going to have. Not one time. And now the courts are recognizing, because the signs have always been there. Now we're not all of a sudden, 30 years later, we're going to consider certain factors when we're sentencing a juvenile. The science has always been there. The system has always failed to look at the science. And this unfortunate reality is that some who were sentenced during the 90s have been psychologically impacted by that arrest, by that conviction, by that sentence. Because the sentences at the time were 30 years or more, life sentences for children. They were getting sentenced more harshly than any adult was getting. Now we got 2013, and New Jersey wants to look at how we can solve that problem. And it took nearly a decade for the Supreme Court to make a decision. To make a decision for the legislators, for the policymakers, to make a decision that children should not be treated like adults. I benefited from James Coleman. And I was able to petition the courts for resentencing. I was fortunate that I had supportive family, and for 3 decades, I educated myself and transformed my life. And when I went before the courts on a motion based on James Coleman, there was no choice to let me go. The terms that they used when I was getting sentenced was probably the harshest things you would ever hear an adult say to a child. The judge got it wrong, by the way. The judge got it wrong. And it took nearly 10 years for New Jersey to make a move. This is a step. This is the first step. The next step is to make sure that children are treated like children and not adults.
Louis, you're involved with a group of formerly incarcerated folks that are working to help and support each other, but also to advocate for legal reforms and change the narrative, as you so eloquently said before. Can you share a little bit about how people with that lived experience can help shape the narrative?
One of the things that I, and as a representative of the Returning Citizens Support Group, do is educate. Educate people who are responsible for making policies without not one time acknowledging that there are human beings behind the policy that you want to implement.
And one of the things that we continue doing every chance we get is educate folks that that's not the right approach. That there are human beings and there are children that are going to continue to be impacted for the rest of their lives. So we continue to advocate, and we partnership with, of course, with ACLU, with other reentry organizations, Institute of Social Justice, and making sure that what they did in the 90s, what they did during the early 2000s doesn't happen in 2023 anymore. And we're going to change this narrative. We're going to do it individually, and I ask that we do this collectively to change the narrative to make sure that doesn't happen to children anymore.
So we're going to turn to questions in a minute, but I wanted to ask everybody on the panel, what more do we have to do? And what are the policy solutions, the narrative solutions, the hearts and minds solutions that we have to achieve as a society to be where we want to be, which is to end mass incarceration in the United States. So perhaps we could start with New Jersey. Alex, what does New Jersey have left to do?
So much. We've done a lot, right? I think if you take a look at the report, I think we can hold our heads up high about what we've done, but when you spend any time in prison or anywhere else, like you can see how much work there is left to do. So Cynthia talked a little bit about clemency. We are woefully behind some of our sister states in the use of clemency, but I think optimistic that we're going to move forward and take a different approach to clemency, one that that doesn't use clemency as a tool to reward those with political power, but instead as a tool to address injustices. We have this really significant aging population in our prisons, which is expensive, and that appeals to people who are fiscally conservative, but it also is impractical and inhuman, and we have a compassionate release statute that is incredibly hard to access, so we need to expand access to compassionate release. We need to legalize drugs, because not because it's necessarily the driver of who's incarcerated, but because it's a driver of who's interacting with the police. And we need to end mandatory minimums. We have this bipartisan sentencing commission that unanimously recommended that we get rid of most, though they should recommend we get rid of all mandatory minimums. And the legislature and the governor haven't been able to have a meeting of the minds to get us where we need to be. Those are 4 very easy things. We need to end technical parole violations to get people out of prison. That's 5. And we need to just recognize that the humanity of people. And I think, that's why the work that Lewis is talking about is so incredibly impactful, because I think policymakers, judges, prosecutors would have a different perspective, or do have a different perspective when they get to interact and understand the harm that is caused by incarceration.
Can we just go down the road with Sandra? Yep.
I don't think we're going to be able to afford the things that our society needs if our criminal legal systems remains as big and as funded as it is currently. So we really need to divest from criminalization, and that means that the budgets of our prisons and jails and police officers needs to get smaller. There's no way you can have both. You can either feed the beast or you can build the world. You can't have both. And so I think there really needs to be a lot of, I think more criminal justice folks need to invest in budget advocacy for the structural social welfare infrastructure that we need as a community. So not just, job readiness programs, but actual housing, right? Making sure there are jobs, like talking about public works, about like, we need to build these roads, fill these potholes, and a lot of people can actually do that with livable wages, right? So really focusing on how do we divest from the criminal justice system and actually invest in people, right? I would say that our social infrastructure supports are also criminalizing actors. So hospitals are criminalized people, schools criminalize people, public service, social service agencies criminalize people, and we have to get to a place where we are actually changing not just policies or criminal justice legal laws, but changing the way that we engage people who need help or need support from our communities. So what are the administrative regulations that we need to be challenging these places to go to? One of the things that I often say as a social worker is that by the time someone gets to the criminal justice system, they have been failed by multiple systems before they got there.
Right.
So what are the changes that we need to be doing in other systems so that we get less people that we feel like we have to deal with in the criminal legal system? And so really integrating and understanding that if people aren't getting locked up in social services, they're getting locked out of social services. And how do we change that? Technology is an area that I think we really need to talk about, or more people need to support the ACLU in talking about, in that people know that prisons are expensive. They know that jails are expensive, so they're incarcerating you in your home. And they're doing it through different means. And so really recognizing that we can have mass incarceration without brick and mortar jails and prisons. And they're already thinking about that. So how we get ahead. And then lastly, we have to have a conversation about conflict. We can't criminalize everything that makes us upset or uncomfortable. And we need to move away from criminalization. A lot of folks work on mass incarceration, but you can't get to incarceration if you didn't criminalize. And so I spend most of my time focusing on how do we disrupt criminalization as a response to things that we have questions about, that we should be more curious about, that we're not comfortable about. Because you can't build a mass incarceration system if you didn't convince a whole society that criminalization was the only way to deal with things.
Right.
Louis, you're next.
Thanks. I think one of the ways we can make some changes, if the social groups, especially here in New Jersey, get together collectively and make that push. When she talks about decriminalization, it starts where the statute, it starts where the legislators built these laws and statute. If we don't change the statute, I think these policies are still going to be in place. And I think we're going to have the same repetitive cycle of people being held in detention unjustly. We're gonna have the same cycle of people getting sentenced unjustly. We're gonna have the same cycle of children being sent to adult jails for the rest of their lives. It starts with the legislature. It starts changing that statute, and I think collectively with social groups to get together and make that push, we can definitely make a lot of changes here in New Jersey. Yeah, we all agree that New Jersey is really slow. They're on sloth mode. Because it took 10 years for them to recognize that juveniles should not be treated like adults. But it takes that first step for the social justice groups to get together and make that push. I think we would definitely make a huge impact here in Jersey.
So I agree with what my esteemed panelists have already said. I'll just add that we have to care. You know, I've heard many times people in my circle say, well, I could never have been enslaved because, you know, fill in the blank. I wouldn't have put up with it, or I wouldn't have been an owner, or whatever have you. We have slavery in America today. And so the question is, what are you doing today about the slavery today? You know, each of us can care about an issue and address that issue. We can serve on a jury and not avoid jury service in the system that we currently have. Because if you are not there, guess who is there serving, right? We can go and talk to our legislators. Yes, they work for us. So we should tell them what we want them to do. The voting season is their interview. But when they get the job, we have to hold them accountable. We can collect with each other to make powerful movement and understand the power that we have. We are not powerless to change this system. And it is up to us to tell the system and the actors in the system more specifically that people are not disposable. You will not do this in my name, and I demand that humanity be recognized in this system.
So we've got a couple of minutes for questions. So are there any questions in the audience? Does you want to hear, and then there, yeah. Thanks, Scott.
Okay, thank you. Hi, my name is Marion Bay, and thank you so much for this. I really appreciate this. I remember in November when I'm sorry, okay. I remember in November when the Buckham sisters were released from the prisons, and it was a bit much. Because in my opinion, the state was not prepared for what they were doing. And what I noticed, and I'm glad that Sandra, you mentioned this, because one of the key things is that what they needed was housing, what they needed was technical skills, what they needed was employment. You know, and so it was good that they came home and we were able to help them. But however, in my opinion, the training and preparation starts inside. So the question is, how do we get this system to understand the importance of beginning that training on the inside? Because I work in the system, and I see what they've done. So how can we get them to understand the importance of doing this on the inside?
Anybody itching to start?
Sure. It needs to start on the inside. It also needs to continue on the outside, and it needs to, the truth is, as we were preparing for these releases and understanding that there were going to be these gaps,
Yes.
we identified lots of really terrific community responses, community reentry supports that were ready and willing to help, but needed access. They needed money. They were ready to do the work,
Right.
but they're not getting the funding. And so we have this very bizarre system where we have people who want to do the work who aren't getting the funding, and then you actually had legislators who held up the releases saying, well, we were worried there's not sufficient reentry supports, but they weren't offering to provide more reentry supports. They were just using it as a way to hold up the releases. So absolutely, it needs to start on the inside, the DOCEU stuff, and it needs to transition. But I think what we really transition as people get out, what we really need to avoid is adding to the capitalism problem, right? We don't want to create a reentry industrial complex,
Right.
where, and we see it already, where there's this incentive to send people from prisons to halfway houses that are prisons,
Yes.
right? And with a
Yes.
different name and privately funded, and right, people should be free. And we need to try to figure out how to free them and then provide them the supports, whether they're coming home from prison or not. We need to make sure people have access to housing and healthcare and education. Those things aren't just for people coming home from prison, they're for everyone. And that's why I think, like, it's right, we can't, the world we want to live in might cost some money. And we can either choose to pay for the world we want to live in or the carceral system. And we have to pick. And I know where I'm putting my
I would add that one of the things that, why I mentioned the conversation about administrative changes, right, is also the fact that people were coming home and couldn't go back home to their family members because some of them lived in public housing because there's a bar of people coming back into the home, right? And so that conversation, it's like, yes, people need training, but the truth is, people can't even go back to where they came from, right? And so the criminal justice this goes back to my conversation about like, how do we build the preparation for the world that we want? It's not just getting people out, but it's also making sure that what are the other things that are not the criminal legal system that are making it, that are based on them staying in, right? And so what are the additional campaigns that we should be talking about, pushing back against, like HUD, to be like, actually, no. People should be able to come back. I have family members that lived in public housing for decades. Like, why is it that their family members can't come back into those places, right? And your point around the industrial complex, there's an economic basis around incarceration. It is a market, and we are the products. And so really figuring out how are we disrupting the incentives for people to continue to make money off the subjugation and capture and kidnapping of our folks.
I want to just briefly say something. Ms. Miriam is correct that it starts from the inside. In 2013, the academic world realized that education was a key to reduce recidivism rate. And they started what is called the New Jersey STEP program.
Yes.
And they provide college education to men and women on the inside. In addition, they prepare them post-incarceration transition into the college world, right? Because education, you'll realize that it was the key to reducing recidivism. And everyone who participates in these college programs, in the inside, both men and women, the recidivism rate is nearly zero. It's proven that men and women are hungry to educate themselves, and we provide the tools so that when they come out, the transition is successful. It's a success. That is a step that legislators and policymakers need to consider when providing services to the men and women and preparing them for their release.
I just want to add a small thing. I think if you're going to spend my money, I need to know what you're spending my money on.
Yes.
And so we ought to know what's happening in prison.
Yes.
It ought to be transparent to us.
Yes.
When I was on the Colson Task Force, I asked the head of psychology or mental health for the Federal Bureau of Prisons, how are you measuring the impact of imprisonment? And she said, we're not. Then what are we doing? Why are we putting people in prison? And then blaming them for not succeeding when they come home.
Exactly.
So we can advocate for transparency in our system. What are you spending my money on?
Yes.
Did you get that question?
Hi, thank you for doing this. My name is Oscar Nunes, and I work for the County Registrar's Office. I want to thank Mohamed for inviting me here. My question is a quick question. I'm just curious, out of the United States, what are the top 3 states that have most, the prisons that are making the most money doing this? It's like a business, it seems like.
I can't answer that question off of the top of my head, but I can tell you the Corrections Corporation of America is making a lot of money. And we have private leased prisons in our federal system. So I would venture to guess that it's the federal system that is the most private, money-making system. The telephone systems aren't regulated, so the fees are astronomically high, and the families bear the burdens of that. There are private healthcare systems that are not provided, that are providing Tylenol when you need something stronger, and making money off of that. So I don't have the answer to the top 3 states, but I'm sure the feds are near the top of that because of the expanse of the federal system. And again, they're spending your money.
And it's not just private, right? Because
Right.
there are communities across the United States that are dependent on their local county or state facility for employment, right? So you've got communities whose economic engine is incarceration. And whether it's public or private, that matters. But, when you have people's livelihoods dependent and incentivized by incarceration, that's a real problem.
Yeah, and I'll tell you how twisted it is. In Georgia, we had a local jail system where the sheriff could keep any money he saved. So to feed the people who were populated there, he bought tractor trailers filled with corn dogs and only fed them corn dogs. And it took a lawsuit to stop that, right? So it's a perverse system.
An organization that's doing work on this question that you're asking, that's also like naming and counting and naming all the companies that are investing and making money on it, is this organization called Work Rises. And it's run by a person who's actually from New Jersey, Bianca Tyler. And they publish a report every year that looks at all the businesses that make money off of incarceration. They run multiple campaigns on telecommunication and suing investors who are like owners of basketball teams. Like the owner of the Detroit Pistons, I believe, Tom Gores, is like a major investor in telecommunications. And so if people want to know more about like who's making money, on these different things. Workrise is an organization who's focusing specifically on the prison industrial complex and the different businesses that are making money off the caging of our folks.
Right, so it's a prison policy initiative. And you know, police uniforms, military uniforms are being made under slave labor in prison. Desks that government officers use are being made by slave labor in prison. So again, it's a perverse system.
Mic check. Can everybody hear? I got 60-something-year-old ears. I have to ask the question. Before I make this offering, I just want to say a couple things. One, I'm very proud of your ACLU because we also make noise. Right? And Marla wanted to report that yesterday I was in Trenton with Jim and Ami and whatnot, and we were making some noise for some important bills that need to be heard. Last week we had a rally around community-based violence intervention bills. Some of the things that my sister here was talking about that need some support. And Jim showed up, and Jim was dead on point. And Jim is a returning citizen in our ranks. So, you know, your ACLU has done some things, and Alex over there, our warrior in the court, somebody very special on a lot of fronts. And in mass incarceration, there's also this thing called death by incarceration. People don't get out, right? And Alex has always been our voice that has petitioned for someone very special to me who got out last year that they said would never get out. His name is Sundiata Akobe.
Come on now.
Co-defendant of Assata Shakur,
Yes.
who just by virtue of what the law says should have been out in the 1990s, right? But he got out last year because he never gave up and we never gave up, and that's the traditions that we come from and we represent. So let me just do what I was asked to do, and I don't get often asked to do this, even though it is something that I do. This is a piece that I wrote to help mark this time. We're in a crazy crossroads time. COVID driving folks' anxiety off the roof, and we got some crazy folks who want to push us back to the 1880s that are violent and very intent on doing that. Right? We had some Proud Boys show up in Trenton at our rally yesterday, and we had to isolate them, right? In front of the State House, right? Threatening to do some things that you shouldn't be able to threaten to do at a State House, right? So, you know, these are indeed in the language of Roberta Flack. This is a poem that goes into a volume of poems that I'm calling the Soul Poems. Trying times. In 1972, we had somebody else in the White House who was very dangerous also by the name of Richard Nixon, and I'm probably one of the few in this room old enough to remember Richard Nixon. He was a bad dude who had to go, right? And he's a dangerous dude who had to go. And we need to make some other folks who were dangerous go too, because we are the people. We are the people. We need to believe that. It's called Trying Times. Boom, ba-dum, boom, boom, ba-dum, boom. Ba-dum, ba-dum, boom, boom, ba-dum, boom, boom, ba-dum, boom, boom, ba-dum, boom, ba-dum, ba-boom, boom, boom, ba-dum, boom, boom, ba-dum, boom, boom, ba-dum, boom. Trying times. Trying times. Yes, indeed, these are some trying times. Crying times, dying times, big old white lion times, sad times, mad times, bad times, germ spreading, hate spreading, sick times. Times pawning black and brown essential workers on the lung puncturing altar of sacrifice that is COVID-19. Crying times, dying times. Yes, indeed, these are some boom, ba-dum, boom, boom, ba-dum, boom, boom, ba-dum, boom. Torching times, scorching times, wildfire screaming times, despairing times, glaringly unjust, dramatic, traumatic times, toxic, fuming, pluming, choking times. I can't breathe, George Floyd, Javier Ambler, Eric Gardner, Elijah McLean. I can't breathe. Dying times, crying times, white lion times, global warming, wildfire screaming times, cruel times, Cold times, ICE agents butchering families to pieces times. Times of cell block torture, sterilizing and rape. Times of homemade terror caught on our cell phones, videotape. Crying times, dying times, boom, ba-dum, boom, boom, ba-dum, boom, boom, ba-dum, boom. Stifling times, trifling times. Dramatic, traumatic, Trump trampling, tyrannical times. White lying times. Wildfire screaming times. Sad times, mad times, bad times, boom, ba-dum, boom. Alienating, divisive times. Afrophobic, Islamophobic, homophobic, hurtful and hateful, boom, ba-dum, boom. Hateful times, boom, ba-dum, boom. Crying times, dying times, white lying times, boom, ba-dum, boom, boom, ba-dum, boom. But these are also bold times, gold times, binding times, bonding times, unforgettable building times, outrageous but also courageous times, monuments to white supremacy, colonialism, slavery, toppling face first times. Times of young people marching against hate, homelessness, joblessness, gentrification, ethnic cleansing, and police killing. Dangerous times. Black young, brown young, white young, marching loud, marching proud, marching together. Boom, ba-dum, boom, boom, ba-dum, boom. Seizing these times. Boom, ba-dum, boom, boom, ba-dum, boom. Wheeling times, dealing times, smoking, choking times, but these are also some hope cradling, boom, ba-dum, boom. Sage smoking, boom, ba-dum, boom. Healing times. Resistance times, resilience times, grinding times, binding times, mobilizing, organizing, coalition building, unifying times. Boom, ba-dum, boom, boom, ba-dum, boom, ba-dum, ba-dum, boom, ba-dum, ba-dum, boom. Defiant times, defiant times, gold times, bold times, soul times. Boom, ba-dum, boom, boom, ba-dum, boom, ba-dum, ba-dum, boom, boom, ba-dum, boom. Boom, ba-dum, boom, boom, ba-dum, boom. Yes, indeed, these are some trying times. It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains. So said my sister Carmen Sachi.
I am not going to follow that. So I'll just say thank you all very much for being here. Thank you for supporting us. Thank you for being a part of the ACLU. And thank you for the hope you bring into the future.
Thank you,
Appreciate it.